addresses critical concerns confronting the Philippines. Formed soon after the democratic restoration in 1986, it promoted both freedom and responsibility as joint values, without which one or the other has little meaning. The newfound freedom involves not just media professionals but the public they serve. And like all liberties, freedom of the press has its limits, for the simple reason that it is vulnerable to abuse. Against this background, CMFR was organized in 1989 as a non-stock, non-profit organization with three flagship programs: promotion of media ethics and responsibility through the monitoring of news coverage to identify weaknesses and failings in the practice, press freedom protection and media defense that tracks attacks and threats, campaigns and advocacies to check incursions on press autonomy through laws and other means, and the recognition of journalism excellence and best practice, which is designed to encourage quality in journalism. All three flagship programs of CMFR are linked by the larger purpose and objective to help develop a free press that would serve as the fourth pillar of democracy in the Philippines. Our MC and moderator this morning is the founder and executive director of the Center for Media Freedom and Responsibility. Melinda Quintos de Jesus was among the women columnists of the Bulletin Today who wrote critically of the Marcos regime. After she was eased out of the job in 1983, she worked as editor of Veritas News Weekly, a news magazine on the front lines of the alternative press that galvanized public will to question the dictatorship. Her career in media includes columns for leading broadsheets, among them the Philippine Daily Inquirer and the Philippine Star. She co-hosted a political TV talk show with Jose Marie Velez and lawyer Perfecto Fernandez, as well as a column on the air for radio. She organized CMFR in 1989 and developed its core programs: media monitoring, press freedom protection, and
Good morning. Am I on? Good morning, and thank you everyone for joining us. On behalf of the Center for Media Freedom and Responsibility, or CMFR, a warm welcome to the second Jaime Ongpin seminar online. I think the most faithful participants in this seminar see this event as a celebration of press freedom because it is also part of their core. Their a core value in their own personal system of beliefs and in their way of life. The program puts them in touch with journalists who are set apart by the quality of their work, their innovative efforts, showing of their convictions, journalists who have given hope that no matter how difficult the work may be, a free press lives and thrives and will assist the rest of society to find solutions to our most desperate problems. Honorable guests, Dr. John Paul Vergara, Vice President of the Professional Schools and Professor in the Department of Information Systems and Computer Science of the Ateneo de Manila University, friends of the late Honorable Jimmy Jaime V. Ongpin, and members of his family, media colleagues, friends, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for making up such a great audience this morning. It was heartening for me to find out how quickly we received reservations from faculty and students from schools around the country as a way of making sure that their places were secured inside the studio. I would like to read out the names of all the schools who have registered for places in our virtual hall. There is Adamson University, Assumption College, Centro Escolar University, Colegio de San Juan de Letran, De La Salle University, Far Eastern University, Kalayaan College, Miriam College, Polytechnic University of the Philippines, St. Scholastica's College, University of the Cordilleras, University of the East, University of Iloilo, University of the Philippines, Baguio, University of the Philippines, Cebu, University of the Philippines, Diliman, University of the Philippines, Los Baños, University of Santo Tomas, and last but not least, the Visay- West Visayas State University. My apologies. We also have journalists, friends, and partners from civil society. We have friends from the past who still remember Jimmy Ongpin, and there are new first-time guests who are asking themselves, who is Jimmy Ongpin? Who is Jaime V. Ongpin? We do answer the question in the course of the program because this, after all, is a memorial program in his name. But our happy mix of audience is a signal that the program is alive and growing, drawing a bigger audience while retaining those who, through the years, have enjoyed and appreciated the panel discussions enough to keep them coming back for more. The digital platform has not diminished the appeal, but has in fact made it possible for CMFR to reach more students, faculty, more of the public we serve. We had 180 persons in the hall in 2020, but the simultaneous live stream of the program on Facebook was watched by thousands more. Three other organizations, Rappler, Philstar.com, and Now You Know, had live streamed and cross posted their program with CMFR on Facebook. And after 2 weeks, 40,000 plus viewers had seen the program. CMFR has had to modify the program for 2021 because of circumstances imposed by the pandemic. The Embassy of Canada in Manila decided, and we concurred, to hold off a selection of the Marshall McLuhan Fellow for 2021 because of travel restrictions and continuing limitations on forums and meetings. Christian Esguerra, who was named in 2020, has yet to do the study tour of the media organizations and universities in Canada and the lecture program in campuses around the Philippines, for obvious reasons. And in line with this development, the Board of Judges also decided not to pick a recipient of the Award of Distinction. This year, our announcement ceremonies, which usually provides an exciting end to the program, will be brief. But the program in 2021 is richer in terms of discussion. We have two separate panels instead of just one, which means more time for each panelist to talk and also more time for you, the audience, to ask questions or comment during the open forum. Because there were so many questions which did not get read last year, I'm suggesting that you take down notes, place your questions right away on the chat box to make sure your question gets asked. And we ask you to type your name, school, or office. Also add the province along with your query or your comment. When the program's objective was to encourage the writing and production of in-depth reports, or what we called then investigative or explanatory reports, we called out, in some years, third, second, and first prizes in the two categories. But even then and now, it is the panel discussion that is the heart of the program because it provides that direct encounter with journalists who share their difficulties, disappointments, and lessons learned. In turn, journalists also get to connect with their public, not as sources, not as subjects of their news, but as stakeholders of the process. On another level, the seminar links classroom teaching to actual practice and live lessons that can deepen what textbooks and lectures have to offer. By holding up models, the seminar invites more and more people to discern quality, follow journalists who make them better informed, more discerning, and when necessary, to become more skeptical of official statements and claims, more cognizant of the value of facts and evidence, more questioning of policies, and critical of implementation. A thinking audience becomes more critical of the press itself. A free press is not a monolith. The press community is made up of different kinds of practitioners. There is much that is flawed, irrelevant, and trivial that makes it to the news. Producing quality in any field of endeavor involves care and constant attention. It is the same in journalism. It is like working in a greenhouse, tending a story to life. For underlying the kinetic energy of news production is a sacred duty bound in values of truth, of freedom, and justice. The JVO seminar is probably the only one of its kind that brings the press and the media audience together to focus on the issues of the press as well as those of society in general. The public, after all, participates in the work of the press, and hopefully, both producer of news and consumer of news are grounded on the same values and principles. Unlike other programs that give awards, CMFR never calls for self nomination, as CMFR's work is about identifying quality journalism. So, how do we choose our panelists each year? I call on Professor Luis Teodoro, who has been teaching online during the pandemic for the University of the Philippines, where he served 2 terms as Dean of the University of the Philippines of the School of Journalism in the University of the Philippines College of Mass Communication. Professor.
Good morning to everyone. There are 8 panelists in this year's Jaime V. Ongpin Journalism Seminar. They were selected by senior journalists who are members of the Center for Media Freedom and Responsibility Board of Trustees. Those who were selected, the 8 journalists in the panel were Melinda Quintos de Jesus, who is also CMFR Executive Director, Tina Monson Palma of ABS-CBN Network, Ed Lingao of Television 5, Berhel Santos, former chair of the editorial board of Business World newspaper, and myself. The panelists were chosen through a 3-stage process. It began with the CMFR staffs putting together a list of those journalists in print, broadcast, and online media whom they had cheered throughout the year for the consistently ethical and professional excellence of their work in terms of providing the public the accurate and meaningful information needed on the range of issues that currently confront this country. That list was then forwarded to the selection committee, some of whom submitted their own choices in addition to that list. The board members then drew up their short list of possible panelists, which were then discussed during an online meeting and limited to 8 journalists, the possible members of the panel. The board also agreed on the theme of the JBO Journalism Seminar, which this year is on the present as well as the future of Philippine journalism, given the current state of the country in these perilous times and the even more urgent need for an adequately informed populace, as summed up in the questions, where are we now and where should we be in the coming years? How has journalism done its tasks of providing the public the information it needs? And can it do better in the future? Exactly what will be the shape or what should be the shape of journalism in the coming years? No Marshall McLuhan Fellow was chosen this year because last year's fellow was unable to undertake the study tour of Canada because of the restrictions imposed by the pandemic. Thank you to everyone, and I will now surrender the floor to CMFR Executive Director Melinda Quintos de Jesus.
And the selection is never easy for jurors. There are logistic issues to consider. We cannot include more than who we can place on screen for a discussion, or in the physical events, who can be seated at a table, apart from the limited funds. So the judges have to force themselves to reach a consensus. They all have to agree. The discussion goes around a bit before everyone is satisfied. Given this kind of scrutiny, the panelists have already passed stringent review by experienced journalists. And I always say that every panelist is already a winner. For everyone's comfort and convenience, we will hold a 5-minute bio break after the first panel discussion, which we shall prepare for as we move along through the program. We have held the JVO seminar in the midst of political crisis in the past. Political ferment makes the seminar more interesting as the journalists share their perspectives about how they covered problematic or very controversial events. We are in the heat of another election, which many see as a moment of historic reckoning for the nation. These conditions suggested a discussion that should go deeper than just the current circumstances. When Filipinos cast their ballot in 2022, their choice must reflect a fundamental decision reflecting values and principles in life. Are you voting for democracy, or are you opting for dynastic authoritarianism? How much do we believe in a democracy as a system of government, as a way of life for us and for the generations to come? I think we need to begin to ask ourselves whether we as a nation are committed enough to making democracy work. And if not, what are we going to do about it? Throughout our history, the press in the Philippines has played a role in the struggle for freedom as an instrument of rebellion, of resistance, and revolution against foreign oppressors, alien occupation, and in the 80s against homegrown dictatorship. The experience of serial colonization highlighted the power of publications and the ideas that these carried as an instrument to unify and consolidate the will of the people so that they can join together to challenge the control of those in power over their lives. These passages reveal how, at certain points of history, the press and people can unite for a cause. One of the most dramatic examples unfolded through an extended period of dissent as alternative sources of news, the Mosquito Press, and those aligned for truth and justice formed a people's parliament on the streets. In February 1986, propped up by other institutional forces, formed a wall of Filipinos on EDSA and forced an end to the Marcos regime. This joint activism between press and public, unfortunately, does not always happen. Filipinos are characteristically passive in their consumption of news. Mere viewers of the unfolding action on the political stage, they are observers of the clash between powers, the confrontation between the high and the mighty. And they are rarely drawn to the fray to determine the outcome. It is like they are watching a soap opera. Democracy demands a more engaged public, and this passiveness must change. It is the same for the press. For most journalists, it's a career, it's a job. Reporting the news means waiting for something to happen. And many still feel that a neutral stance is required by the so-called standard of objectivity, which actually may cover up for lack of principle and lack of conviction. A pity then, because the press is structured within society as an agent for change. Throughout the history of media, newspapers were read so widely and provided such a singular reference for so many that the knowledge and ideas provided a shared framework of understanding. They may not always agree, but it made it possible for people who did not know each other, who had never met, to act in concert as though they had talked about a purpose and a means to achieve a goal, which is why John Kerry had described journalism as a national conversation. Newspapers have exemplified the strong tradition of rules, which, even if observed in the breach, had provided a solid foundation of values ensured by verification. Television added the power of camera to the news, imprinting pictures in the public mind. And radio continues to be, for many Filipinos in remote areas, the only connection to the conversation of the rest of society. But we are now in the age of the internet, where ironically it has become difficult to engage with one another. How do we hold a conversation on the silos of doubt, distrust, and hate that the algorithms of social media create? Technology has taken over how we communicate with all its bias and division, because it is biased for division and polarization, not for greater understanding of our differences so that we can find common ground. We have found that the internet, which is now an integral part of our lives, is really only as good as the values held by the people who use its power. That this immense power has been taken over by governments and political groups unleashing venomous political propaganda is the tragedy of our times. This is the background of today's discussions. The last 6 years of the Duterte administration have coincided with a near complete dismantling of an age of news as we have known it in modern times. It is happening all over the world. People think of news in a different way and pick and choose according to their particular interests. Verification and facts seem to have lost their value. The news no longer gathers the family or community together, and even radio and its ceaseless chatter has become a solitary medium. When in the 1990s, cable services in the US began to break down the hold of the three major networks in America, Ted Koppel, the gray eminent anchor of Nightline on ABC, worried about the disruptive effect of the balkanization of the news, the breaking down of the unifying force of news. This was ages before Facebook, before Twitter and Instagram or TikTok further cut us off from one another. Perhaps the question in his mind then, as it should be in ours, how can citizens have a meaningful exchange of ideas in their separate worlds of news that they create for themselves? What happens to the process of democratic consensus when we can no longer talk from the unifying framework of the news we read, of the narratives we know, of its various but related perspectives? There are more and more numbers of netizens who cannot discuss their differences except in confrontational, even contemptuous speech, whose political views are so enclosed by an algorithm that they can no longer connect with others as Filipinos and as human beings. Last year, the Jaime V. Ongpin Fellows discussed the impact of the pandemic on how they have had to work, added to the attacks and threats from the administration, which culminated with the unprecedented closure of the largest TV network not only in the Philippines but also in the region, the ABS-CBN. Today, we will talk about how journalism is changing or has changed, and how advances in technology have radically transformed the landscape of news. Our panelists this morning feature a number of those we call senior members of the community, with record careers that secure the respect and esteem of their peers, say the media establishment. But altogether, even with these so called elders of the profession, the median age of our two panels remains quite youthful, incredibly at 31 years of age. Our jurors were stunned at the youthfulness on display, given the bylines that were already recognized for prolific production and impressive quality of reports, the sharp handling of interviews, the clarity of explanatory segments, but more so the innovation, the energy, and the dogged inquiry to expose the truth that are often sidelined in the rush for 24/7 news. It does take energy to do journalism, and the reporting from day to day or from crisis to crisis is for the young. And it is also the young who know about the digital wilds to be able to craft new ways of telling the story. What is the impact of these changes on how journalists do their work? For many of the world out there, it is reduced to what they click on to their gadgets. As individuals are bombarded with so much information and at unprecedented speed, that has developed, ironically, the failure to connect with others, to be able to only to to check whether one is right or wrong, and refusal to confirm or change their own notions. Add to this the spread of propaganda and its manipulation of facts and misrepresentation of truth. People used to read the news so they could be informed and understand complex developments. This age of news or that age of news is coming to an end. Some of us have not thought much about this, although we realize that indeed our news habits have changed. We can only now trust that there is a future and that the best and the brightest journalists can formulate a transition into a brave new world. These journalists are still very much rooted in the established editorial process, but they have had to adjust and to recreate the media to reach out to those even younger than they. We are asking this morning both panels to help us figure out how we can all cross the breach. Digital natives, some of them, still share the same concepts or values which I hold in my late 70s about what journalism is about and what can change and what must remain the same. I have given the title Future End to the panel discussion, the first panel discussion. Where is the public in this age of transition? How do they communicate with this media audience? What is the place of news in the lives of the people? What challenges can they identify and what have they done to reach out to them? I am so honored to welcome the first four panelists to the first discussion today. And let me read out their names in the order of their alphabetical. First, Lian Buan covers the justice beat for Rappler. She writes in-depth stories and explainers on corruption, legal processes, and Philippine courts. She hosts and produces Rappler's podcast, Law of Duterte Land. Lian was part of the group of reporters that produced Rappler's drug war series, Murder in Manila, which earned awards from the Society of Publishers in Asia and the Global Investigative Journalism Network. Lian is also the associate editor of the online news magazine subselfie.com, which she co-founded with other young journalists working in different news companies, a development that CMFR cheers. Crossing the lines, between rivals and competitors. I call on Edson Guido. Edson is the head of ABS-CBN's data analytics team, which he also launched in 2017. Since the beginning of the pandemic, Edson had reported COVID-19 analysis, charts, and trends. He serves as a resident and analyst of ABS-CBN for all its news platforms. And Edson has delivered lectures on COVID-19 statistics, contributing an article on the Philippines' recovery from the pandemic to Columbia University's Journal of International Affairs. An economist by training, Edson was previously a data analyst with the World Bank. He is currently a PhD candidate in UP Diliman's School of Economics. The next is Franco Luna. Franco is a content producer for philstar.com. He has written explainers, fact checks, in-depth stories on politics, human rights, and ongoing pandemic, among other issues. Prior to his work in mainstream media, which began the year he graduated from the university in 2019, but even in his early work, he had already gained recognition. An associate editor for The Guardian, the Ateneo de Manila University student publication, he received the Raul L. Locsin Award for Student Journalism in 2018 and 2019. Franco served as resource person in recent journalism workshops in UP and Ateneo. This year, he was also a resource person of Human Rights Watch for its Forum on Human Rights Reporting under the Duterte administration. Welcome to the fold, Franco. And last but not the least of our four, I call on James Relativo. James is content producer and reporter for philstar.com. He is the sole Filipino news writer for philstar.com, Filipino online news portal under Filipino Star Ngayon. He is one of the hosts of Anyare, a little bit that we showed you in the loop earlier, philstar.com's bi-monthly video series that explains complex issues in a light and humorous fashion. James, but effectively. James previously worked with News 5, where he edited videos, produced social media cards, and wrote news stories for anchors like Ed Lingao and Lou De Vera. We have always seen, let me put them all now on screen. Welcome. So good to have you here. We have seen the value of news and the work of journalists as a force for good governance, reporting on officials so the people as voters know whether those elected are doing what they are supposed to do. Do you feel that your audiences are still looking for this? Is news still a way of checking abuse of power? And this can be answered by anyone. And my reminder is, do not go beyond 3 minutes. You will get a little note from our team backstage for you to stop to make sure that we give everyone a chance to speak. The value of news as a check against bad government, abuse of power. Can I call on anyone then? You're ready, right? Leon, would you like to start?
Yes, ma'am. I think we should. I think we should, and I mean, I'm from my echo chamber. Sometimes dangerous to just base on your echo chamber, but I think they're beginning to increasingly care about news as a way of checking good governance. I see it on my feed all the time, but I would also like to see if it goes beyond Twitter. And I guess that is the challenge, that is the existential challenge of all journalists, to see beyond their echo chamber and see what needs to be improved, to be able to make news more relevant, because it should be as relevant as it should have ever been.
Thank you, Leon. Anyone to follow up on what Leon has said? Franco?
Yeah, okay. I think that the tendency to control the flow of information that journalists get in this pandemic is in itself an acknowledgement, an implicit acknowledgement from government officials of the effect that good and people-centered journalism has on in a democracy. And I think over a year into the quarantines, the fact that the biggest challenge is the red tape and the secrecy and the hostility we get from officials should speak for itself already.
And do you think the public is aware of this, of the barriers that are being set up by government? Are you making people aware that there are these efforts to bar the news the news that you journalists are looking for? Where is your work there, or is there a kind of silence involved in how you've fallen out of a Viber chat, for example, for asking difficult questions?
Yeah,
Is this a story for your public? Is this a story for your public?
Yes.
Frank. Go on.
That's it.
Yeah, everyone believes that. And we would like to see more stories of those. Why? Because journalism is a force in society, and people must know what is happening to it, right? Franco, did you want to add a little bit more on what you said? I thought I heard you.
yeah, I was just gonna answer your question. I think media could do a better job at communicating, um, not just these difficulties, but its role to the public. I mean, today it's so easy for officials to ignore questions over Viber, like you said. It's so easy for them to later cry, "Why didn't you get my side?" And all of those things are enabled by the quarantine, and it makes it so much easier for the government to control the flow of information that reaches reporters. By extension, they're able to control the narratives. So I think
Right.
you could do a better job at explicitly communicating that reality to the readers who are looking to them as well.
And telling that story so that it can be understood. Anyone else to add before we move to the next question? Or would you like to be able to say, for example, how do you think you can enforce these values? Or go ahead, James, if you want to answer any of the previous segments of that question. Uh, James, I saw your
I would
hand.
just
Go ahead.
I would just like to add dun sa sinabi po ni Franco. I think it's our job to let the public know, no, that there is a kind of barrier being set by government and various institutions for the public to have reliable information. For one, the freedom for information is already there as an executive order, but currently there is no law for it. And at the same time, the president himself, he hasn't given his own state salin, no, from 2018 to the present era, no. So that kinds of that pero napapakita na rin yan, no, kung ano yung klaseng polisiya ng gobyerno natin or ng powers that be pagdating sa kung anong klaseng impormasyon lang yung nais nilang makarating dun sa audience. No? I think it's our job as journalists to let the public know where their money goes to, kung napapakinabangan ba to ng publiko talaga, or we need to make a more critical public to hold the people in power accountable. No, I think media has that capacity, and I think the people, even yung masa, no, na binabanggit natin, may pakialam naman talaga sila, even when you're just riding the jeepney or the taxi. The taxi drivers
Reading.
often talk to you about corruption and
Right.
how the government tackles certain issues currently. No, so
Okay.
the public does want to know.
Salamat. Salamat. I'm no longer in the thick of things. And so really this kind of feedback that there is residual, it is there. We just need to help it out, draw it out a little bit more. Why? Because that's how government needs to listen to the people. They have to hear the people's voices. Edson, did you want to weigh in before we? Yes, go ahead.
Yes, ma'am. Like, for instance, when we talk about COVID cases, most of the time the reporting that is done is about the totals because that is what DOH is reporting every day. And when media would actually ask for more questions, at times there would be no response at all. And this is where data journalism would come in. Like, if you look at the same total number of cases, it would be very different if broken down into areas of where these cases are coming from, especially if there's a geographical shift in where the spikes are happening. And these developments also have critical implications, especially if the higher number of cases is reported in areas where the healthcare capacity is not as well equipped to handle a surge. And this actually happened in recent months when the ICU bed
Yeah.
occupancy rate at the national level was just at moderate risk. And yet, if we dig deeper, there were many regions that were at high risk or even worse at critical risk.
Right. And we have been following all your tracking yourself because we don't get it anywhere, much of that anywhere else. I will go back to more of your data background because I think this is a new field that many of those very successful journalists are just not familiar enough with. And I welcome, I think, that development, that there are stories there to get. Let me ask James about Anyare. What what brought about this innovation? Maikling kwento at pwede mong gamitin,
Oo.
sabihin sa Filipino.
Oo.
Share lang. Sige.
Ano lang,
Anong
currently kasi,
nangyari?
anyari, no? Basically, binuo namin siya, no, as a concept, as a show, rather, to explain yung day-to-day news, no? Kasi, alam naman natin na merong barrage of information, napakaraming news. Minsan yung mga mahalagang impormasyon, nababaon siya sa breaking news, no?
Natatabunan.
Na ang nangyayari ay quantity, no? Ang daming lumalabas na impormasyon, pero wala tayong panahon to probe further, question further, delve deeper, no? Tapos maganda rin na pinackage namin siya in a way na nakakatawa, medyo light, no? Kung nakita natin yung video kanina, kumakanta pa nga ako na may emoji sa mukha, ano. Pero at the same time, those kinds of humor, making things lighter, it makes heavier information, heavier things easier to digest, lalo na para sa, halimbawa, sa mga millennials, para sa mga Gen Z, no, na dahil ano talaga sila, no, sa internet talaga sila naglalagi. Tsaka marami rin kasi talaga na misinformation na lumalabas online, no, gamit yung YouTube, yung TikTok, no. So why not use those avenues to educate the public further, no? So that's the point of Anyare, no. So I would also like to thank yung mga katulong namin sa Anyare, no. So nandiyan din yung aking co-host si Save Gregorio and Jazz the Buena, who helped us string this project alongside with our editors. So, gusto namin talaga makapag-inform ng public, lalo na yung mga masa, no, na Tagalog yung medium, no, lalo na marami talaga, lalo na sa CD market na hindi masyado nag-i-English, no. So I think it has that potential to make some sort of explainers na may kaakibat na konting komentaryo.
Salamat, James. Very good. And I hope indeed that people will spread the word about it because it does simplify and makes more accessible some of the things that are difficult to explain. Mahirap sometimes intindihin kahit na meron ka ng ibang impormasyon. Ano pa kaya yung mga hindi naman talaga naghahanap ng impormasyon dahil ang media sa kanila pang entertainment, pang distraction, pang recreation na naiintindihan natin bakit naman hindi, di ba? For much of our history, the history of journalism, however, we have always talked about news framed as stories or as stories. Ano yung kwento? Kwento, anong nangyari? Anyari nga, kwento pa rin yun, di ba? What adjustments now do you see that you have to do in order to make journalism play a role in society? Let me call on Franco again as our youngest in the fold. Yung story ba, meron pang nakikinig sa storya o gusto na lang yung mabilisan na kung ano man yung nasabi sa Twitter, ng insulto, ng ano or whatever. Ano yun? Paano yun natin yun susundan?
I think the rush po that we see on social media is a reflection of the fact that people go to news looking for good news, no? And I think that my solution has always been to go to the community, because the biggest problem, the way I see it, is that really everything right now for journalists is defined by who we can access online. But at the same time, we know that not everyone is accessible online. So while it's easy to hope for tenacity and commitment to the story, um, that kind of persistence in reaching out will only get you so far. So what I'm saying is, I think that when the information at the top is this controlled and this, oftentimes this whitewashed, I find that the best practice and really the only correct way to respond is to go straight to the bottom, to the people who are directly affected by issues instead of the people controlling the issues.
Okay, so mag-shift na yung angulo, yung inyong paghanap ng storya. Your search for stories begins or should be moving away from the established powers that be na laging pinupuntahan ng journalists, and find stories pa rin, di ba? Yung mga kwento ng nasa komunidad. Yung mga kwento ng mga taong nandun, nabubuhay, na madalas hindi natin mga tao sa laylayan, sabi nila, the marginalized, those on the sidelines of society, where are their stories in the news? And stories still, but shifting in terms of where those stories are coming from. Anyone, a quick add-on? I will ask one more person if anyone does. Otherwise, yes, Leanne, go ahead.
I would just like to add na siguro there was a time when the norm was presumption of regularity, diba? If an official says this, we immediately presume that it is true and that is the fact. Pero sa tingin ko, yung nakita ko this past 2 years or even 3 or 4 years, dapat shattered na yung presumption of regularity. I think the immediate mode or yung automatic mode ng mga journalists is be cynical of what officials are telling you and what government is telling you. And it doesn't hurt to ask and ask and ask 10 follow-ups, even at the risk of you being kicked out of a Viber group. Kasi it's a disservice to your audience to, take officials line, hook, line, and sinker. Kasi ilang beses ko na rin silang nakitang nagkamali or even worse, nagsinungaling or, the convenience of omission. That said, though, I think journalists have to avoid writing stories like they talk to each other. Kasi tayo, alam natin kung ano yung sinasabi natin and we cover this every day. Siguro dapat lang merong mode na you have to write your stories in a way that a person is hearing it for the first time would understand, so that they know that, okay, meron palang ganito, merong dynamic na ganito. So I think that's a room for improvement for all journalists.
Salamat. Very, very good point. Indeed, the context of the stories. Journalists do not write for one another. Please, we are writing for the people out there who are seeing it in the first way. That is why you are a journalist. Yun yung punto nun. Diba? Edson, go ahead. I was actually going to ask you a question, but go ahead if you want to add to that, and I will segue into my inquiry with your work. Yes.
Okay, ma'am, to
Tuloy mo
your
lang.
question, I think right now we're seeing new ways of doing journalism. That is correct. And we will continue to adapt as journalists. But for me, the basic principles of truthfulness, accuracy, and accountability should always remain. And with the advent of fake news and alternative facts, the storytelling now should be more nuanced, providing context and not just a he said, she said style of reporting. Because right now, we really have to go beyond the headlines to better inform our audience of what is really happening. And that is where data journalism for me really comes in, because when you have numbers, you have something that is factual, objective, and evidence-based.
Ituloy mo na. Doon naman yung question ko na isusunod ko sa'yo, Edson. Ano yung connection between journalism and data science? Bakit mahalaga na makita natin yung mga kwento na naroon sa data na tinitingnan mo and people like yourselves? I think every news organization should have a data analyst on hand who will be able to, look at these and be able to draw out the points, the realities that they are demonstrating. Continue.
I think right now, ma'am, with trust in the media at an all-time low, one of the best defenses is really to provide data alongside news stories to help improve the quality and the accuracy of our work. So for me right now, gone should be the days for journalists to avoid basic math or statistics, as some stories are better told through numbers like, for instance, inflation, unemployment, economic growth, or even the COVID pandemic, and of course the elections. But as with other complex stories, for me, what's really crucial is that journalists should also know how to condense this data through interactive graphics and the creative use of charts, as well as other means of presenting data that are easy to read and understand. So for me, really data-driven journalism, it goes hand in hand with the current landscape where we're seeing an expanding of the digital world, because this can really be a good medium for more comprehensive but easy to digest stories. Because for me, if you look at large data sets, they're really a rich source of a lot of good information. Because like in our COVID coverage, for instance, in terms of the level of granularity, as well as the trends through time, you can do way more if you take a deep dive into the data rather than just relying on the pronouncements coming from the government where they're just basically reporting the totals.
Okay, thank you so much for that. And let me just, one last question as we have now time to our audience for their questions. In investigative journalism, I suppose I will have to direct this to Lian very quickly and ask you also to make your answer to the point. Mahaba ito usually dahil masyadong maraming issues na kino-cover, na tinitingnan mo, hinahanapan mo, etc. Anong adjustments ng IR rather, investigative reporting, para mas maraming makinig? Pwede bang yung mga gists ng IR pupunta sa anyare, pupunta sa, pwede din sa data? Anong cross-breeding pwedeng mangyari? Or did you have something else to say about IR?
Sa Rappler, ang ginagawa namin, lagi kaming merong at a glance sa taas. Kasi we are assuming that people do not have the time to read 1,000 to 2,000 words. So we try to condense it in bullet points sa taas. And we have also taken the habit of breaking it down in parts. Our drug war series last January, we have to break it down in 3. And that took a lot of pain to break it down in 3 kasi para sa amin, we have been investigating it for 1 year. So feeling namin, memorize na namin yung story, we easily get it. But we were made to realize that for people who are reading it for the first time, hindi nila yan magigets in one sitting. So we had to break it down to 3. And then, yun nga, I think mas maganda sana, ako, ang pangarap ko talaga is for investigative reports of another news organization to be taken apart and condensed and followed up by another news organization, kasi pangarap ko talaga yung cross-media collaboration na it doesn't have to be mag-i-scoopan tayo kapag may investigative report yung isa, i-follow up nung isa. And diba, I mean, what would be a dream for my story to be broken down into anyare, diba? Para ang saya nun. So sana I could reach a life where pwedeng mangyari yun.
At dapat sana talaga mangyari. Salamat, Lian, for bringing that up. And I will now conclude my part of the discussion with you and open up the process to the questions of the audience. And I am waiting for that to be flashed on screen. From Ed Lingao, from TV5, kung pwede maghabol pa ng tanong for the younger journos. How did SOCMED change the public's appreciation of news and journalism? With so many people merely relying on SOCMED instead of visiting actual news sites, do people still get the big picture? Or just micro pictures fed them by SOCMED algorithms? May habol pa ba? Yes, go ahead, Lian.
Yung first part lang ng question ni Sir Ed yung sagutin ko. How did social media change the game? I think the public now are more empowered to claim their stake in journalism, which they should. Mas empowered sila na, we are entitled to your transparency, to accountability, open up your journalistic process more. And I think that has made a lot of journalists uncomfortable kasi parang, wow, bakit kami nang iniimbestigahan kami dapat yung investigative reporters? But I think we should be more open to being scrutinized by our public, and that is the only way that we could at least have a fighting chance in getting back the trust in media.
So it has worked a good effect in terms of
In
saying
some
we
way.
also need to be evaluated. Yeah, of course. We need to. That's the one way that you have seen it anyway. Anyone else that wants to add this to this question, to Edlingao's question? Meron pa bang habol yung mga storya ng journalist? Yes, I see James.
I
James, go
think yeah.
ahead.
I think yes. Although I think yung current landscape ng social media, lalo na halimbawa sa Twitter or sa Facebook, no, nagagawa niyang bite-sized yung information, no, for the people to digest it easier. Pero lalo na kasong problema, nagiging double-edged sword nga siya, no, dahil parang kapag nakita mo na yung headline, nakita mo na yung caption, may mga times na ang gagawin mo na lang i-share mo pero hindi mo babasahin, no. So I think that's another point of challenge for us journalists to para hikayatin, no, yung publiko na i-click man lang yung yung article, no, kasi madalas yung meat nung impormasyon nung balita nandun sa loob, no. So I think we should do a better job at that, na halimbawa nasa lead pa lang, nasa headline pa lang, kahit na hindi nila maklik yung article, at least malaman na nila yung pinaka-chunk ng balita, no? Pero yun nga, minsan kahit sa pagiging witty pa lang yung pagiging witty ng headlines or kung ano man, may mga times na naging double-edged siya, no? Na hindi na nila i-click, parang nasasatisfy nila sila at times dun sa headlines or dun sa mga captions, which I think can be a double-edged sword.
Thank you. We move to the next question. I think we have from Restituto M. Aquino III from the University of the Cordilleras. Do you think memes can be an alternative to reach out more to people, especially in terms of government's incompetence? Are memes a useful instrument? A quick answer to this question. Yes, James?
Yes. Para sa amin, halimbawa sa PhilStar, hindi lang sa Anyari, no, sa PhilStar din, ginagamit namin siya, no, para mas makapag-probe further. Halimbawa kapag may statement, halimbawa yung isang personality, no, from the government, no. At times nagagamit rin siya para mas madaling maintindihan yung information na mabigat para sa mga marami. Halimbawa sa Anyari, nagagamit din namin siya to make people understand complex issues, make things more humorous, at the same time make them more engaged, na panoorin nila hanggang dulo kasi nakakatawa, no? Pero at the same time, it's informative. No? It's not just information, pero parang mas tignan. Nakakatawa siya, no? Tapos tatapusin siya. Pero it's also a challenge kasi may mga times na kapag ginagamit siya madalas, it kind of makes the information less credible for some people, no? So there must be a balance na kailangan i-strike pagdating doon.
Okay, so kailangan evaluate lagi, no? Titignan mo, ano ba yung effect nito para bang trivialize natin.
Trivialize, yes.
Parang hindi masyadong importante. Sa
But
akin yung meme.
But it has its potential, no?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yes.
To me, it's like the new editorial cartoon. Isang cartoon noon, sa editorial page. Yun yung mensahe. Puntong-punto, nandun na siya. Wala ka nang kailangan pang sabihin.
I mean, if people spreading misinformation are using memes to misinform the public, why can't we use that to inform the public?
Okay. Absolutely. For the truth. And I move to the next question if there is one. Carmi P. Rivera, no identification, nagiging popular na ngayon as a way of writing the news headlines sa social media, kung tinatawag na shady headlines. Okay lang ba ito? Shady headlines. Because this might influence the audience perspective. Shady headlines. Parang sa akin, explain. Anyone? Do you have a hand, Franco? And then I'll go to James. Okay, the two. Take that.
Yeah, I think this goes back to the question of social media then, na parang you get it first, but you also get it watered down. I think these types of headlines are a sort of response to that, to make sure na the information is still bite-sized, but at the same time substantial. I don't think there's anything unprofessional about it, as long as at its core it's still factual, it's still corroborated by sources. I don't see anything wrong with it, wrong with those. Um, I mean, there's a reason the term infodemic was coined. Diba? It's the overabundance of information available in social media. I think when you have headlines this pointed, that's how you cut through the noise.
Okay, thank you. And James, yes, you want to add to that?
Same thoughts kay Franco, no? Pero at the same time, I think witty, shady headlines, it does its job, lalo na kung hindi ka makapagtanong, makapag-follow up questions dun sa yung dun sa person na nagsasalita sa artikulo mo, no. Halimbawa, naglabas siya ng press release, naglabas siya ng statement, no, pero hindi wala ka sa Viber group niya or kung ano man. Pero alam mong he's spreading misinformation, no. Even in the headline, you can place na halimbawa may sinabi siyang fact. Halimbawa, sinabi niya 1 plus 1 equals 11, no? Tapos pwede mong banggitin na, pero actually, 2 lang yan. You know? Parang pwede mong banggitin ng ganun yung headline, no? Which is at the same time, you're calling a spade a spade. You know? It's still factual. Hindi problema kung banggitin mong blue yung sky. Diba? It's true.
Very short lang,
Okay.
Ma'am Melinda, if I can add.
Short. Go ahead.
Na I agree with James and Franco. I think yung debate na yun is would it influence the perspective of your audience? Para sa akin, I think we shouldn't have to flinch away from influencing the perspective of our audience, kasi we are agenda setters rin naman after all. So in the world of disinformation and misinformation and so many lies and so many misleading information in the internet, we have to more aggressively play that role by executing carefully and factually shady headlines.
Kahit
Yes,
na
thank you.
pwedeng mag-tax.
At every point, parang pwede mong laging dapat tignan at i-check. Ano pa dapat ito? Ano pa yung idadagdag o ano pa yung dapat mong mas i-clarify? And I think in that short period, you have given us so much to think about and so much to digest. And the feedback, at least for many other journalists, I think is at least one way of looking forward as we move from the end of a particular age of news. We are now at 10:35, so we've run a little bit over time. And I am now instructed to say that we are having a 5-minute bio break. Please return to your places after 5 minutes.
Sir, you earlier said that the president is lauding them for what they did. So it's like he's lauding them for breaking the law, for bypassing certain processes. He's a lawyer. Does he not know better? And the president sees nothing wrong with what the PSG did. Can the palace now give the public details about who provided the vaccines to the PSG, what process it went through?
Ayon sa CHR, mula 2016, sa higit 3,000 reklamong inaksyonan nila, 14 pa lang na criminal case laban sa pulis ang umabot sa korte. Pero sa tala ng PNP Internal Service, sa higit na 6
Am I on? Yes, and we are now on our second part of our program and our second panel. I am calling this panel Deep End. As young as these senior members of the press may be, they have been through the mill, assigned beats, fought their battles in the newsroom, and all of them have attained the respect of their peers as well as their employers. I am going to ask them to dive deep and draw up from the depths of their experience their evaluation of journalism and its place in our changed and changing landscape. We are not in a good place. Democracy has been assaulted, the freedom of the press attacked and curtailed. Every member of the panel has been shaken from their comfort zones, either banned from the coverage, dealt with censorship, harassed by vicious threats and attacks online, loss of jobs. And yet, they have held on. And I want them to describe why and move us all to walk the road ahead. I will now call on Miss Camille Diola, who leads the newsroom production, direction, and innovation at the PhilStar Global Corporation, the digital arm of the Star Group of publications. She started as a news reporter for the company in 2012, eventually heading the editorial team of philstar.com in 2015. CMFR has cheered the work of their news lab under her direction. Camille is concurrently the editor-in-chief of Interaccion.com, a rebranded digital news site that reframes online conversation, is working with a small team but is doing such marvelous work. For Camille's excellent editorial leadership, CMFR has recognized PhilStar.com with the Award of Distinction in 2020. Our next our next panelist is Christian Esguerra, a reporter for the Inquirer daily newspaper covering foreign affairs before moving to ABS-CBN News to become a political correspondent. He has covered governance, human rights issues, the Bangsamoro peace process, and communist insurgency. He is best known for his work as anchor of Matters of Fact, a daily morning news program that aired on ANC until May 21 this year. He now hosts ANC's Evening Talk program After the Fact, where he continues his incisive, tough, no-nonsense interviews. Christian teaches political journalism, media ethics, and social communications at the University of Santo Tomas. CMFR recognized him with the Award of Distinction in 2019, and in 2020, Christian was named Marshall McLuhan Fellow by the Canadian Embassy in Manila in partnership with CMFR and the Jaime V. Ongpin seminar. The next is Mike Navalio. Mike Navalio is a multi-platform journalist for ABS-CBN News based in Manila. He also co-anchors the 7 a.m. edition of ANC's Rundown. As ABS-CBN's Justice Beat reporter, he reported the ouster of Chief Justice Maria Lourdes Sereno, oral arguments on the petitions challenging anti-terrorism law, ABS-CBN's shutdown, and the decision of the International Criminal Court to authorize the probe on President Duterte's war on drugs. Mike Navalio is a lawyer, okay? So this is exactly his beat. Mike has produced several reports on the drug war. He was part of the team that has produced War on Drugs, The Unheard Voices, which was recognized in 2017 by the Society of Publishers in Asia. Before joining ABS-CBN in 2015, he worked as a litigator for CICIG Law and as a research consultant for Amnesty International's research on police torture. Recently, he started teaching law on mass media in UP College of Mass Communication. The next is Pia Ranada. Pia is a multimedia reporter for Rappler. She covers the palace and other political beats as well as elections. Pia has also reported on the environment and climate change issues. She hosts Rappler's broadcast Seat of Power and the one-on-one interview program Rappler, talk, newsmaker. Pia's work has gained formal recognition from awards programs of different universities, local media groups, and advocates of environmental issues. So the four will make up our next panel. And I am not going to direct any question at any one specific person. I'm going to let you have a free for all in terms of how you want to answer the questions. Uh, we are talking about changes in the news landscape. Some of these have involved conflicts with the public that you serve. What do you now see as the most serious challenge confronting the work that you do? What is the most serious challenge given the divisions in the audience itself and conflicts that involve the people that you are sharing the news with? Can
Hi, ma'am.
anyone speak
Hi, ma'am.
on this?
May I start?
Yes, go ahead. Yes, please do.
Kung
Do not be
nagkakahiyaan
shy.
pa.
Continue to
I
do.
just want to start kung
Go ahead.
nagkakahiyaan pa. Okay. I think it's very clear that since 2016, the biggest threat to the free press in the Philippines has always been made clear. And that threat goes by the name of Rodrigo Duterte. But over the past few years, since he assumed office, I think this threat has morphed into something even more serious. And this concerns journalists even more directly. The threat of, or the reality of self censorship, of second guessing ourselves. That even if a story has been well vetted, even if sources have been properly verified and their information have been verified, parang there's always this tendency these days, an after effect of this Duterte threat on a good number of journalists today in the Philippines to actually censor themselves. For example, the way we tweet, gone are the days when it comes to certain newsrooms when we used to call a spade a spade. But in recent years, I noticed na medyo nagtitipto yung mga journalists out of fear of reprisal, not just from people on social media, but from people themselves, from people in power in particular. This also goes to the heart of the issue when it comes to, let's say, newsroom managers or owners, basically going to the extent of even censoring their own newsrooms, just so they won't go into the just so their newsrooms won't get into trouble with Malacanang, Bongo, Alan Peter Cayetano. So that's it. That's one of the biggest threats that I'm seeing now.
It is the acceptance of the newsrooms of this power. It is the sense that one cannot fight it. In a way, it is a recognition of our limited capacity given the power of the state. That's my reading of the first answer. I want everyone to hold in their minds might what might help us confront that power. Whose power when the press itself is not able to stand up to the power of the state? Anyone wishes to add through this to the
If I
discussion? Yes, please. Pia, go ahead.
I agree with Christian that Duterte really is the overarching threat. But I guess corollary to that would also be the fact that Duterte's presidency has kind of highlighted a certain misunderstanding of media among Filipinos. I think a lot of us underestimated exactly how deep this misunderstanding is. Duterte really is the when we see people who are so easily swayed by arguments of the government or of Duterte's allies that when media writes negative news, we are working towards the destruction of the government. We are not patriotic. I've heard this line echoed by so many officials, even the spokesman himself, even Duterte himself, calling journalists who ask questions, critical questions, unpatriotic, as if our job of unearthing anomalies in the government is somehow anti the Philippines or not or some not recognizing that we do this, especially for Filipinos, so that they can assess the government better, make decisions better, and hold these officials accountable. So I think it's really very fundamental no, na Filipinos, I think we've seen that very limited or skewed yung understanding ng ilan sa atin of exactly what media is there for. That just because a headline is negative doesn't mean we're out to get someone or we're out to bring down the government. In fact, diba, the role of media really is to make the government better, to make our leaders better. And I think so many people have lost sight of that because we have this narrative that the Duterte administration so masterfully builds to the people who listen to them.
And Ma'am Melinda, if I could just add.
I think she's on mute.
Ma'am, I think you're on mute, ma'am.
It is the lack of understanding of what the role of the press is and what it is doing. I don't think people really understand. I would have to agree with Pia, and that let's hold that again as one of the streams of thought that should be holding our discussion together. Mike, I'm sorry. Yes, go on, please.
To add to that, and just to add to Christian's and Pia's point, I think the consequence of all of these, when you have a president constantly attacking the media, and then you also have social media users actually doubting now how the media behaves, and the lack of understanding of how media works, you now see a situation where there's increasing polarization of social media users or even viewers and users of the media. And there's now a kind of an iron wall that we need to penetrate. When social media users, for example, see posts from like Rappler or ABS-CBN, they would automatically dismiss it as not useful or misleading or false or biased. That's something that we also need to penetrate. How did it get here? Because regardless of the content, the manner by which we present our stories, if these stories do not come across to our intended audience, I think they will fall on deaf ears. And so it's really a challenge for us how to penetrate that iron wall.
Thank you. And Camille, did you want to weigh in on this or not?
I would agree with my colleagues here, especially also what Christian said. And I think this is also what we've been trying to communicate to our audiences, that how difficult it is to work in this social political environment. On top of that, there's also the challenge posed and the threats posed by technology on reaching these particular audiences. You've mentioned in the first panel, Ms. Melinda, that you're also observing that audiences are dispersed. Some of them are on TikTok, some of them are on Twitter. There's a different audience also on Facebook. And where in Facebook are they lurking? The fact that the iron wall that Mike was also talking about is how to penetrate that. And these iron walls are also posed by the technology platforms, social media networks, and we are not. Our news, for example, no matter how factual it is, how well we produce it, how accurate it is, how critical, but if it doesn't really reach to those segments of audiences, that is also one of my fears, and I think it's a very real threat now that somehow we feel more and more as elections are coming.
I agree, definitely. We recognize the power that Duterte unleashed. It went into the lack of understanding and used that weakness, the lack of understanding of what the press is about, and whether our audience still values the press and for what it does. And so I think fundamentally we need to also agree that there is a lack in the stakeholders with whom we are working. There is not a strong enough conviction about the value of a free press to be criticized. And this is something that I want to call other stakeholders to recognize, because the press will not be the one. The press in itself and the media itself would not have that capacity. We need other stakeholders to be part of growing the power to speak truth, to state power.
Yeah.
From there, I would like to go back to some of the practices that have always defined news. And to me, this is the failure of media everywhere in the world. That as the world began to change, and as the stories began to change, as developments began to get too complex, that we were stuck in the nest of news conventions. I mean, every student going through journalism, 101, will say, what makes news? Timeliness, widespread interest, prominence, personality, and if there's ally, even better, because people are interested in that. So it is actually feeding people what they want, or what they are generally likely to say, hey guys, what happened to you today? And no other overarching reality that interferes with that need to, I need to be connected. I need to know what happened like now, right now. How does this tradition get in the way of actually doing the job of informing the public, not as public curious about what's happened, but the public of citizens that are choosing the leaders in 2022? We are heading towards a campaign that's already actually begun. What are the adjustments do you think that we need to keep in mind and bear in mind as we move forward in trying to help voters make the right decision? Because that is the point of free press. In the end, that is the point
Okay.
of a free press. Christian, go.
May
And
I,
then,
ano, may I put this particular issue on the table because this has been very pronounced lately. I think especially in terms of performing our tasks, our roles as journalists in covering the campaign for 2022. I think everyone agrees that the 2022 elections are very, very important. In fact, a matter of life and death, quite literally. Pag pumili tayo ng bugok o masamang tao for president or for senators, definitely that would have direct impact on the lives of people, including ourselves. So this is a time when we cannot cede our responsibilities as journalists. Hindi natin siya pwedeng bitawan o ipamigay. Especially under a scenario where normally politicians running for public office in 2022, they would go for the widest reach available to them. And lately, of course, we're seeing that they're going toward the path of tapping influencers, social media personalities to provide them with that reach and also leverage to get their message across. So of course, you cannot expect the celebrities to ask the tough questions, to actually scrutinize the track record of these politicians, because that's precisely what the politicians want. They don't want their track record to be scrutinized, or if they want their track record to be scrutinized, it has to be scrutinized only up to a certain point. So, for example, given a choice between uh, getting interviewed by someone like Pierre Rañada or another journalist, and a choice of being interviewed by Tony Gonzaga or another celebrity whose questions won't necessarily be offensive or um, tawag dito,
unfriendly.
unfriendly, definitely would go to the celebrity because ma-achieve mo yung gusto mo, di ba? So ano ngayon yung challenge when it comes to journalists? We are not supposed to actually um, surrender this responsibility. We have no choice but to get these people in front of us and answer our questions because they have all other avenues available to them these days. Before, they would have to talk to the journalists, and this is a very basic function in a democracy. For example, madami tumatakbo dyan, di ba? As a rule, I really make sure that kahit sino tumatakbo, all those track records, lahat ng positions that they took in the past, inconsistencies, they have to be called out. Pero ngayon, pag ginawa mo yun, di ba, usually you will be the one to be called out. Parang sinasabi sa'yo minsan, bakit mo ginagawa yan? Eh, parang binabastos mo yung politiko. But people tend to misunderstand, as Pia mentioned, the basic function of journalists. Before I end, I'd like to mention this very concrete example that I experienced, I think, last year. There was this political analyst who, in fact, works as a political operator. who basically called me out on social media asking why I was asking those questions which I did toward a particular government official. Eh dapat daw, guest yon, resource person. So I don't know what that particular political operator meant. Ibig sabihin ba dapat inistem ako yung guest, sinabi ko, good luck sir, maraming salamat po, ang galing-galing niyo po. Now, pwedeng gawin nyo ng celebrity doing that interview. But if you're a journalist, you're basically not performing your job properly because you're not basically committed to finding out the truth about that particular politician, candidate, or public official. And in fact, you are doing a disservice to the viewers, to the readers, to the audiences. Kasi ang pinapasaya natin yung in-interview natin, which should not be the case.
Okay, thank you. And we had Camille, right? Was Camille's hand or not?
Yep.
Sorry.
Yes, ma'am. My hand was up, but of course, after Christian said all that, it also made me think. I guess it will also touch on some of the points that Christian brought up, especially on how we can actually reach those audiences, and that there are many that they can, and with the politicians can already choose their own platforms and whom they want to talk to. I mean, if I were a politician, and there are so many platforms that are actually as powerful or more powerful, say, than one show or one influencer, then I choose the friendlier ones. I wouldn't go to Christian's or PS show or Mike's because I know that I'd be asked the tough ones, the tough questions. Now, this is just an idea, but what if, because of all these problems, and there are so many stakeholders, what if we welcome some of these influencers or some of these content creators, welcome them as part of our community? They might not be professional journalists, but if they are, if we count them among, as part of the news media, or at least try to also seek accountability from them, transparency from them, that they have to also mention their sponsorships, they have to mention their who's backing, who's funding their program. Then we could also school them somehow about these journalistic principles, and then, because otherwise it's easy to slide towards partisan politics, to cutting corners in the course of reporting, or not being opaque about who's backing who. And I think this is something that we can also kind of improve as a community of journalists, that we have to also be open to these other platforms. Of course, there will be a lot of complications there. These celebrities are not professional journalists, and these celebrities are also in it for for something else other than the mission of journalism. So that's just one of the ideas that I have. Now, Ma'am Melinda, you mentioned also about the news conventions. If we're going to have to interrogate these news conventions, I guess in the course of my career, I've also realized that the things that we were taught in school, like prominence or timeliness or etc., those still apply. But I would now like to look at them as these are, because this is what makes a story. That something a story is engaging, a story is interesting because there's a prominent personality that we're presenting. And I guess if we look at it as that these are storytelling devices, these are storytelling techniques, and that they actually appeal to the psychology of our audiences, that we can appropriate them, raise the level, raise their quality to actually meet. To raise the standards in journalism, but knowing how we can make use of these conventions to
Thank
communicate
you.
to a wider audience.
No, that to me is a great idea. That means that in the newsroom, you continue to teach, you continue to learn, you continue to recraft, right? Basically, the stuff that you have always been using can be reapplied, but you must reapply for perhaps new purposes. In the whole issue, I think of, whether politicians have this package or that package, I think we need to remind our managers, owners, if necessary, but really the entire media thing needs to be governed still by full disclosure. I mean, who are the block timers? Who are celebrities? How do they choose who gets whatever? I mean, how do they support themselves, etc., etc.? All of these things are necessary. This is a block timer. We have nothing to do with it. It is not part of our news. that necessarily corrects, immediately corrects it. This is a PR piece. This was not designed to get at the truth of the dictatorship and the family.
Mhm.
Was that a hand? Okay, let me go to Mike and then I'll go back to you, Pia.
Now, I think one complication that has arisen in the past few years, especially in 2016, is the rise of social media influencers because they're not governed by any rules, not even by COMELEC in terms of spending by politicians or by those running or seeking government offices. So it would be hard on the part of the COMELEC actually to regulate and monitor how much is being spent on social media because that's not part of our legal framework right now. What they have is monitoring over traditional media. And so when you advertise, for example, on ABS or GMA, the COMELEC will know how much is being spent, but not on social media. And this is particularly important because how many influencers can actually influence voters to vote for a particular candidate just because, silently they were paid. They were paid, say, 50,000 pesos per post. How do you seek accountability for those social media influencers? And I think the psychology now of social media users is that they tend to trust more the social media influencer whom they see on a daily basis, with whom they have a familiarity, as opposed to traditional media. You don't develop affinity to, for example, corporations, but you develop affinity towards certain personalities whom you identify with. And that's really the challenge. Our laws haven't evolved to actually keep up with our technological advances.
And as we go on with the campaign, we really need to call attention to the need for revising some of these laws. I mean, that just absolutely do not make sense anymore. And just call on all those legislators to get on their backs and give us elections or campaigns that work. Pia, you had your hand up.
Yeah, you were mentioning about conventions that we should be questioning, especially during as we head to election season. And one practice that I see every election, and particularly in the 2016 election, was for journalists who are covering campaigns to just really write about the words, the remarks, controversial statements made by candidates. And I feel that this is a convention or a practice that we should draw away from, because as we saw in 2016, diba, Duterte dominated the headlines just because his remarks were so outrageous, were so spectacular, were so parang out of this world. So what happens is, if we focus on this kind of journalism, all our readers will read are these outlandish statements, and we won't anymore go into the deep discussions on policies, on platforms. I think it's important for journalists covering the campaigns of candidates to know that every word they say, these candidates say, are really just a pitch to voters. So I think newsrooms, it's really incumbent on newsrooms to allow their journalists some time and resources to write the in-depth pieces that really compare, the track record of these candidates, not just what they've said, but what they've done. Obviously, words are important; they're a signal of what kind of leader they will be. But it's important to not limit our coverage to just he said, she said, especially when we know what we've been through, right, in the 2016 elections, and how the same personalities will likely be engaged in the same kind of messaging in the 2022 elections.
Let me move our discussion forward into the future. Given what has happened, we are in a very bad place. I mean, we can't have conversations anymore. And within the press, one always even needs to check, I shouldn't forget that. We don't agree on many political fundamental issues. And so, where or how do we cure ourselves? How do we heal ourselves, if I may say the word, that we have become so sickened? Are we still going to be able to restore ourselves in the practice of democracy? Does democracy have a future here? Democracy has to thrive on some basis of common ground, some basis of consensus. How do you look at the polarization that has been achieved? And where might you place the efforts of journalism on that? There are several questions in that preparatory thing that I had just said. And I think you can just draw out and just talk about it for the rest of the period that we have in this part of the program. I had Pia's hand up. I have Mike Navalio's also. Pia?
I think, ironically or not, I think the pandemic has actually helped in a way restore democracy. Not right away, not like our freedoms are back, but more of it's kind of given a leveling play field because the pandemic is influencing and affecting so many Filipinos, whether you're the Duterte supporter or Robredo supporter or wherever in on the political spectrum. It's an issue where everyone is on board with. We all want this pandemic to end. We all want to recover economically from this pandemic, and I think that we have seen this kind of convergence in interest. For one thing, in the Senate, right? I mean, the pandemic procurement hearings are being pursued by administration allies and opposition alike because they all know that Filipinos are affected by it and politics is kind of out of the window when you talk about lives. So I think it's just a really great opportunity for media to capitalize on this. We have a renewed role to play because this pandemic is on everyone's mind, and people are willing to set aside their political differences to get at a better government to find a way out of this crisis. And so I think our role now is really to highlight the challenges and the anomalies that this pandemic is unearthing. It's allowing abuses and making sure that the funds go to the right places. Media has been doing aggressive stories on this, and I think if we keep doing this better and better, I think we will be able to restore some of that trust in Filipinos,
In the
and
media.
we're already seeing this convergence right now.
Thank you, Pia. And I said Mike, right?
Yes. I think the responsibility does not rest with us in the media alone. This is a collective effort. And I think everybody in the Philippines should be able to choose the kind of leader who will respect press freedom and who understands the role of the media and how it can, in fact, help. In the midst of this pandemic, the media can actually help the public understand the pandemic, how to deal with it, and not actually, shut down or go against any particular media establishment or any personality. It has to begin with a choice that we will make in May 2022. And I'm not going to campaign for anybody. It's just that our leaders should be able to meet basic standards of choosing the kind of leaders that we will have. For example, respect for life, respect for human rights. And by human rights, I do not mean the clash between those who are saying human rights just favors the suspects and not the police. Basic human rights, right to life, right to dignity, even to the basic necessities, that's universal. There shouldn't be a debate about that. So it begins with choosing the kind of leaders that we will have.
Thank you very much, Mike. And shall we have closing remarks from Camille and Christian on this issue?
I do agree that our democracy moving forward would depend on the leaders that we will put in power, we will put in place. And there's a tall order on any leader to not just help the country or help the country recover from the pandemic. The economic damage is so deep. People are still looking for jobs. Wages are still low, or there are no wages at all. People are starting also to put up their own businesses online from their homes. Many of our loved ones and friends have also been taken from us from the pandemic. Besides that, also the damaged democratic institutions that we have, to aid that, to restore it, accountability, checks and balances. Besides that, also the very great disrepair, the very deep wounds that all our sectors and our institutions have suffered in the past 6 years. Those are the kinds of leaders that we have to put in place. And as journalists, I think we have to treat these elections as that. The question of whether there will be democracy. This is our existential. We have to treat this as our existential challenge. So the next few months are very crucial.
Thank you very much, Camille and Christian. You're muted, I think.
Okay, sorry about that. Regarding the question on democracy, I think we can still get to keep this democracy so long as we're willing to fight for it. This is something that we should really fight for, because over the past 5 years, a lot of things have happened, and they have severely damaged our democratic institutions. And this is one thing that people should understand: why journalism should remain free, always fighting, always critical, whoever sits in Malacanang. And I think the question regarding the role of the press in a democracy, why a lot of people tend to misunderstand that, goes at the heart of the problem. In schools, how well do we teach democracy? The function of these institutions, for instance, the function of a free press. So lahat yan, nagsasanga-sanga, kaya ito yung situation natin ngayon. That's why we're left with basic questions from many ordinary people. Bakit pa kasi masyado kayo malaya? Puro naman kayo banat sa presidente. So it's very difficult to explain all these things in one sitting, but we have to be very very patient when it comes to communicating these ideas to the people. For instance, a common question I get, di ba? Bakit sa ganitong politiko hindi mo siya ginigisa regarding this? Bakit ito lagi mo ginigisa regarding this? And I think I would like to take this opportunity to answer that basic question. For instance, gigisahin mo ba si Lenny Robredo about human rights? Eh, hindi naman siya yung presidente at hindi sa kanya yung issue ng EG case, ng mga drug killings. Kung si Lenny Robredo yung presidente at siya yung nag-implement ng drug war, kung saan more than 6,000 people based on official government records have been killed, allegedly because they put up a fight, gigisahin natin si Lenny Robredo. Let's say kung maging presidente siya at yung mga pinangako niya ngayong kampanya, hindi niya ginagawa, at nung siya na nakaupo, gigisahin natin siya. Pag hindi natin ginawa yon, basically, we are partisan journalists. Now, since that is not yet a reality, we're left with the likes of Rodrigo Duterte. Under whose watch, a lot of people have died. Institutions have been severely damaged. ABS-CBN had been shut down, despite the lies spewed by Harry Roque and his ilk. I mean, sila yung nakaupo, it goes with the territory. Dapat silang tanungin at the very least. Dapat silang gisahin. So ito yung dapat pinapaliwanag sa mga tao. Bakit yung mga ibang tanong hindi na itatanong tungkol sa ibang mga kandidato o sa ibang mga politiko, pero itinatanong doon sa mga nakaupo. A very basic function of democracy. So I think dapat maintindihan natin to. Tapos when it comes to reporting about the campaign, I think it's also very important for journalists not to, kasi technically hindi tayo pwede maging objective, especially in covering the campaign. For example, given a choice between someone who promises to kill and who actually kills people, and someone who says he would respect human rights. So basic human logic would tell you, di ba dapat doon ka sa hindi ka papatayan, di ba? Hindi ka nanakawan, o ninakawan ka na, iboboto mo pa. So these things have to be taken into consideration by journalists covering these things. Pero ang isa ko sigurong warning dito, sometimes may tendency kasi ibang mga journalists to cover campaigns like they're covering the UAAP or the NCAA. Parang they tend to cheer on a particular candidate because they fall in love, quote unquote, with the sources or the politicians that they cover. Isa sa mga dapat pag-ingatan natin. So the standards are set, they are clear, and they have to be applied to everyone.
Thank you very much.
Just a really
We are going to a quick one, Pia.
Yeah. In relation to what Christian said, I always work on the motto that a good journalist is a good politician's conscience and the bad politician's worst nightmare. So I really agree that people have to understand that journalists are really part of that effort to make our leaders better. And in a way, parang journalists are supposed to screen who are the leaders who get to lead and, use our public funds. So I just really hope people remember that.
Thank you very much. We are now open for whatever questions have come up. And what we are able to take, as we are now moving actually to the end of 2 hours, I would like for you to look at the chat yourselves and see if you can address some of your answers to them if you don't get to those questions. I have Nikki Delfin. Are there media reforms needed for upcoming administrations to consider? What safety mechanisms are missing or should be improved in Philippine democracy? That's a lot to review. Decriminalizing libel is one, right? That's what That's what I have from Pia, where you would not be imprisoned for libel. We are one of the very, very few countries that had this very, very caveman primitive principle still in our books. Any,
Freedom of
I have
information, Melinda.
the
FOI.
freedom of information.
We talk about corruption all the time. That this is a corrupt official. This is a party that harbors corrupt officials, etc. We don't talk about FOI as much. I think it has to really enter into mainstream vocabulary as in that this is a topic that we have to be talking about in our homes when we talk about corruption. That it's as important to be transparent. Um, that we have to be able to demand from officials to even show their sole egg, disclose it. Why do we have to go to the Supreme Court or something? I don't know, and follow up, and then the politicians can actually say no. This is very basic.
So far we have decriminalization of libel, Nikki, if you're listening, decriminalization of libel and a strong FOI framework that actually I think should be built in on the part of government so that it becomes an automatic thing. I mean, you go to government and you want to disclose right away so that you're not having to hide it. Anything. I will move formally to the questions if you have them. Can I talk to the back team? Okay, we have a friend here. What is yours from Edilberto de Jesus? What is your assessment of the objectives and the impact of IATF briefings? Briefings, very quick.
Yeah, I cover
Can
these
I have
briefings every night, mostly. And based on my scientific knowledge, I think that, oh my gosh, the briefings have really evolved in objective. Before, medyo may focus po on pandemic, but recently, and I'm sure you've seen that it's happening twice a week now instead of once a week. It's becoming a way for Duterte to hit critics, to promote his chosen candidates for the 2022 elections. Basically, it's a political platform already. It's no longer just a platform to inform people. It's also very, very tiring and medyo nakaka-bad vibes talaga siya minsan because, parang it's a lot of time spent on things that people don't really care about, that don't really affect their lives, but just affect the political maneuverings of these leaders we have. So yeah, it's really sad how the degrade yung itong briefings and how our government media platforms are really being used to propagate such propaganda.
And that's on our taxpayers' money, right?
Ma'am, if I could
Can I
add.
have another question, please? Add, Mike, quick.
Yes, ma'am. Yes, I think we also need to reassess if we have to actually air these briefings live, if we're giving
Right.
platforms to all the lies that are being spewed in these briefings. And, are we not giving them actually space for campaigning for the 2022 election? So maybe that's something to think about.
And so you could just actually make a deal and say, we will report on what you said and summarize what you made that we think the citizens need to know about. Otherwise, we're not giving you live. Next, do I have questions? JD Todd, Learn Manila. Letran Manila. Would gathering truthful information regarding the career path of election candidates be enough for people to stop and really think about their choices? I am reading this, or should our actions be taken in order to aid them when it comes to making a wise vote? I think the latter question is clearly you aid them, yes. Reviewing the careers might be an aid, right? Don't forget, look at the record of competence. What were the means of achieving what goals? And if everybody kind of looked at Davao at that time, we would have seen what was held, what unfolded. We would have foreseen it if there was more coverage of the past records. If anyone wants to add to this,
Yes,
next
ma'am, I agree.
question. Yeah, thank you. Next question. Jeff Canoy, our calling has always been to tell stories in an age when stories need to reach as many to help make a difference, perhaps a conversation for a change. How can we accomplish this and still remain storytellers and not the story? Okay, it's
May I?
media can be part of the story.
No.
Yes, question and answer, Christian.
I think there are certain exceptions when a journalist, for lack of a better option, needs to be part of the story. Let's say naka-witness ka ng bank robbery, nandun ka sa loob. You can tell that story using the first person. But as a rule, you have to be self-effacing. It's not about you, it's about the story. You often hear this from people. But I think the lure of social media, and this is something that I also realized when I joined television, having been trained for quite a while in print, there's this tendency for journalists to actually build their brand and to present themselves claiming that they are promoting a story, but when in fact they are promoting themselves. So I think there has to be a very serious reorientation, self-examination on a lot of journalists, not to actually focus on themselves. Because if you want to really be the focus of yourself, hindi pwede naman tayong sumama sa show business, di ba? Mag-star magic or mag-apply na artista sa isang producer. But as a journalist, I think there has to be a very earnest effort to focus on the story. So there has to be a reevaluation of what self-effacement is all about. So this is not to discredit the work of a lot of journalists. These things are happy. These things are very laudable. But my point is sometimes that gets in the way of telling that story if you yourself, deep inside you, despite claims otherwise, your real priority is actually to build your brand and to make yourselves known not because of your work but because of your face or your tweets or your comments. Kasi lahat komentarista, di ba? My point is, it's all about the story. And journalists have to be known based on their body of work, not on their body. In this case, your face.
Okay, thank you very much for that. Coming from the media itself, right? I mean, this is how we look at this particular problem of becoming part of a story. It all really depends on how you style yourself or how a journalist styles the story. And people will know, and hopefully that kind of literacy will be there for us to have a more sensitive audience and we'll see that. I think I have time for one more question and then we begin to move forward. I have Brielle Banan from Adamson University. How would you advise young journalists to educate people about the value of a free press and help them separate their biases from what they must truly learn? Before anybody takes this answer, I really want to say democracy education should not be just the press doing it. The press practice must be based on democracy education. And so we hope that there are stakeholder groups there that are looking at their curricula, looking at the quality, and examining exactly how are you preparing your future journalists to understand the role of the press, one, and to prepare the rest of the citizens to understand their role as voters. And so, if anyone else wants to add to that, how can journalists add to this democracy education, the role of the press, etc.? Ken, if you wish, I will take two from the panel that would like to talk about what journalists can do, and then we will be ready to put this to a close, if there are.
Well, I think, Ma'am Melinda, that it's important or it's contributory to people's understanding of media and how it works. Is really being transparent about how we come up with our stories, how we establish our sources, how we work as journalists. Because a lot of times this is very opaque, and there are lots of newsrooms also who don't identify, for example, where they get their materials, or they don't right away apologize for a mistake, things like that. Like, when we engage more with our audience and admit that we are human and say sorry when we are in the wrong, and when we explain really carefully how we come up with the story, and how we come up with our findings, I think that will help in showing people that we are worthy of their trust, and that would help journalists, young journalists, or people who read the news understand exactly why we're worth protecting. I think we always need to prove that constantly with our stories, with our work, with when we show up for interviews, we constantly have to prove that we are worthy of that protection and that trust.
Thank you, Pia. That was a pretty good answer, and I don't know if anyone else wants to add to that. Do I have any more time, or should I bring this discussion to a close? I thank all of you, Camille, Christian, Mike, Pia, for for bringing your best game to this discussion and for always sharing what I think the press and all of Philippine society needs: this courage and commitment to the country, to the nation that we have, and to resolve with everyone else that we shall move forward and try and make the best of it. Thank you for this, and we will move to our closing ceremonies and our awarding of certificates. It is my pleasure this morning to call on Professor John Paul Vergara, the Vice President for Information and Technology of the Ateneo de Manila University, representing the President of the University, Father Roberto Yap of the Society of Jesus.
Good morning, and thank you for this opportunity to give some concluding remarks in this year's Jaime V. Ongpin Journalism Seminar. On behalf of the Ateneo de Manila University and Father Roberto Yap, our university president, I thank and commend our partner, the Center for Media Freedom and Responsibility, for hosting this seminar, which I'm sure many of you here would agree could not be more relevant during these times. The country is grappling with political, economic, and pandemic challenges, and these challenges have brought out deep societal divides. Key to bridging these divides is finding common ground and providing access to reliable news and information. Developments in social media has been rapid and groundbreaking, driven, of course, by technological innovations, but more serious in consequence if we pay attention to how the level and manner of engagement of our citizenry has evolved. This has created a difficult, often dangerous environment for our journalists. We now know, for instance, that social media can be used to manipulate public discourse and spread falsehoods, even hate. There's a need to be creative and nimble to continually refine our methods and norms, yet keep focus on our mission to reach and serve fellow Filipinos in a truthful and meaningful way. I thank the panelists today for very engaging conversations on these issues. Let me take this opportunity as well to highlight that this event has indeed kept with the spirit in which Jaime V. Ongpin lived his life, the willingness to risk comfort, wealth, and personal security for the sake of freedom and democracy, and thus the greater good of our people and our country. The partnership that the Ateneo de Manila University that we have right now with the Center for Media Freedom and Responsibility stemmed from that program that was set up 3 decades ago under JVO's name, the Jaime V. Ongpin Institute of Business and Government. Grounded on JVO's dedication to support the alternative press, the CMFR has gone a long way since then, from holding panel discussions like the ones we had today to awarding deserving journalists for high-quality articles and initiatives. I thank today's speakers and panelists from the different news outfits. I must say I enjoyed listening to the discussions myself and have no doubt that many here found the sessions engaging and thought-provoking. Of course, thank you to the CMFR led by Executive Director Melinda Quintos de Jesus for regularly hosting this seminar. Once again, thank you and good morning.
Thank you very much, Vice President Vergara, and I hope that we shall have more occasions to engage. As a program and memorial to the role of a non-journalist, I like adding my personal experience working with Jaime Velosa Ongpin, a leading figure then in business community who dared to openly question the state of cronyism and its impact on the national economy. He challenged the monopoly of news by newspapers and broadcast companies controlled by the family and the friends of Mr. Marcos. He stood apart from those already in established power. He actively supported, from 1983 to 1988, Veritas News Weekly, which was identified with the Catholic Church but did not receive resources from the Catholic Church. He made sure he raised funds to sustain the operations as well as oversee the editorial meetings which discussed potential areas of coverage, since he and our board of advisors had access to so much more information within their own circles. And yet, he clearly respected editorial evidence. independence. On several occasions, when editors and the board had to settle differences, he would leave the decision to the editor in chief, the late Felix Bautista, over his own preference, and everyone else followed suit. He believed and counseled all of us to work with other alternative newspapers, our competitors, Mr. and Ms. Special Edition, Business Day, and Maraya, so we would consolidate the impact of our revelations. He would write notes to reporters to praise what he had thought was done. A tough taskmaster he made known to the editors when he thought he could have done better. We will now have this experience with Jaime Ongpin that demonstrated how important it is to engage the media audience in the work of growing a press, in developing journalism as a public service and as a public good. The quality of the press does not lie in the hands only of journalists. The public, the consumers of news, have as much responsibility to support press freedom when attacked, when struck down by the power of the state. The awarding of the Nobel Peace Prize this year to Maria Ressa and Russian journalist Dmitry Muratov highlights the importance of the press to democracy. Both awardees have suffered from the clash of state and media. For Ressa, this meant being taken to court with at least 7 counts of active cases as of August 2021, including the order to close down Rappler by the Security Exchange Commission, charges for tax evasion, and multiple libel charges, 3 of which are still on trial. To this day, Maria Ressa is not free. She is simply out on bail. To her credit, she has never been cowed, has never retreated from her position, and Rappler has continued to provide critical news and commentary. But Maria Ressa's experience has been felt by the rest of the media, noting how the same could happen to any of them should they dare to get too close to issues that the administration would rather keep from the probing of either press or public. Recall the effect of the closure of ABS-CBN last year at some level. The example of Ressa and Rappler and the news companies who continue to count the number of those killed during the height of the drug war has weighed down on the press, tamping down criticism and taming Philippine media coverage. When the press chooses to be silent, journalists will continue to report, but report selectively. Mostly, they reduce the reports to recording of what government officials have to say, amplifying the dubious judgments and arguments and the false claims. It takes a constant review to be able to detect the depth or extent of the silence, to be able to list the stories that are not reported or followed up by reports. But this silence is measurable, and it reveals how much freedom and independence the media have actually lost. We can compare the coverage in the past administration and the coverage of this administration and see the remarkable difference. which takes us back to the activist role that the public must undertake when the press is assaulted and becomes too weak to stand up to the power of the state. As we bring this program to a close, we will call on each panelist and read the words on the certificate. We will read the words on the certificate and call on the panelists. For the outstanding coverage that has helped Filipinos understand the complex issues that confront them as citizens, enlarging the role of the press as a pillar of democracy in the Philippines, and for participating as a panelist in a time of crisis in the 2021 Jaime V. Ongpin Journalism Seminar. All of them also receive a modest cash gift of 20,000 pesos each, a very small way to recognize the service they provide to the public, especially in these difficult times. I will now read their names in alphabetical order. Lian Buwan, Rappler; Camille Diola, Interacción and Philstar.com; Christian Isguera, ABS-CBN; Edson Guido, ABS-CBN; Franco Luna, Philstar.com; Mike Navalio, ABS-CBN; Pia Ranada, Rappler; and last but not least, James Relativo, Philstar.com. And please feel free to applaud where you are. We could not have had a better panel for this year. Before we bring the program to a close, I would like to present the members of the Board of Trustees of the Center for Media Freedom and Responsibility. Most of them have worked and continue to work as journalists, but even those who are not are, by their oversight of the conduct of CMFR and now immersed in the issues of the press, have familiarized themselves as well with the field of media development. But having them there, we can be sure we are keeping good financial accounts without deficiencies in reporting. And it is a relief to be able to call on a number of them who are journalists to pitch in or to sub with editing and other assignments. I would like to recognize Francis Estrada, Ed Lingao, Tina Monson Palma, Lisa Ongpin Periquet, Vergel Santos, Luis Teodoro, and myself. I'm still part of the board. I now call on Miss Lisa Ongpin Periquet, who has recorded her closing remarks from London.
Dear friends in journalism and the world of the free press, it is heartening to note that a few days ago, the Nobel Peace Prize was awarded to Maria Ressa in recognition of her continuing fight for press freedom in the Philippines. This is a welcome boost to all of us who care about defending the free press, a pillar of democracy, and holding accountable those who wish to knock it down. Aside from obvious attacks on press freedom from without, such as shutting down a media conglomerate or harassing reporters who ask unwelcome questions, there unfortunately remain many more subtle and intrinsic elements of substandard and ultimately harmful journalistic practices from within that have blossomed and thrived in this country that we should not accept. Let me be specific about a few of these. For example, the easy acceptance of fake news and fact twisting in this social media saturated age, sycophantic and fawning business articles that merely serve as PR fodder, lazy and inaccurate news writing, etc. I could go on and on. All of these purport to pass for legitimate journalistic practice in this country. Let's all work to eliminate them. Congratulations to this year's prize winners and to all of you who have chosen to persist on this difficult path. Your efforts will still be recognized and validated by those who genuinely appreciate and value the important role of the press in maintaining a democratic society. I salute you. Thank you and good afternoon.
For those remarks. And let me now acknowledge all the rest of the CMFR team that makes this program possible. Without the hard work of the CMFR staff, we would not have a program. So let me call on Lara for project coordination, Carol for keeping tab of our expenses, Spencer for managing all kinds in the back room, Geraldine, Anka, Leah, Dino, and Rosanna. But most important, I would like to acknowledge the support of the Washington-based National Endowment of Democracy, or the NED. And again, our continuing partnership with the Ateneo de Manila University, along with other donors who have given their support to this program. Thank you very much for joining us this year, and we hope for a better year in 2022.